Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute for the purpose of asking the Majority Leader about the schedule for the coming week.
Without objection, the gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I yield to my friend, the Majority Leader, Mr. Cantor.
I thank the Democratic whip, gentleman from Maryland, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, the House will meet at 2 p.m. for morning hour and 4 p.m. for legislative business. On Wednesday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for legislative business and recess immediately. The House will reconvene at approximately 11 a.m. for the purpose of receiving, in a joint meeting with the Senate, the Honourable Julia Gillard, Prime Minister of Australia. On Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and noon for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business, with last votes expected by 3 p.m. The House will consider a few bills under suspension of the rules on Tuesday and possibly Wednesday, which will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. The House will also consider 2 bills that were marked up by the Financial Services Committee today, H.R. 836, the Emergency Mortgage Relief Program Termination Act, and H.R. 830, the FHA Refinance Program Termination Act. These bills will eliminate 2 ineffective mandatory programs that, without congressional action, will continue spending on autopilot. The House has already had a robust debate on the discretionary side of federal spending, Mr. Speaker, and will continue to do so, but it's time we turn our attention also to the mandatory side of government spending. I expect further debate on mandatory spending throughout the month of March. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for that information. He mentions that we'll be considering some bills under suspension, as is normal, 2 bills, 836 and 830, presumably under a rule. I ask the gentleman, will those be open rules? And before I yield to him for his response, I want to say that I want to congratulate the gentleman on the process that we considered H.R. 1. While those of us on this side did not ultimately support H.R. 1, I know that the Speaker and the Leader are both pleased with the openness and transparency of the process. I'm wondering whether or not there was a pre-printing requirement, of course, so it wasn't a totally open rule in that sense. But does the gentleman expect there to be open rules on the H.R. 836 and H.R. 830? And I yield to the gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman. And to the gentleman's specific question about next week, I would respond to the gentleman that we are working with the Rules Committee and its chairman, Chairman Dreyer, to be able to announce an open process for the consideration of next week's bills. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Can I inquire, is an open process, is that somewhat of a nuance of an open rule?
Well, I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I think the gentleman also indicated in his remarks the pre-printing requirement in the CR of H.R. 1 provided for it to be a modified rule, and it is in that spirit that I think the Speaker initially began this session, that we're committed to an open process, to have the ventilation of ideas, to have the participation of as many members as possible in the debate of measures coming to the floor. We continue to want to go in that direction as we have thus far. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me say to the gentleman, in terms of a constructive discussion that we might have, and I happen to believe that the pre-printing requirement is a positive requirement in that it gives notice to people. One of the things, as we know, that it requires, however, is the printing of amendments prior to the time you know the status of the bill at the time you might offer the amendment. I suggest that perhaps we have discussions about how to take care or take into consideration the process where you pre-print an amendment. Prior to getting to your amendment, something is changed by a previous amendment that might require a modification of your amendment, in terms of an understanding on both sides that perhaps we would accommodate either by unanimous consent or some other process that change. I yield to my friend just for his thoughts on that issue.
I thank the gentleman for raising the point that did come up during the debate of H.R. 1, and I would say back to the gentleman that it is probably a very good discussion to take place within the context of the Rules Committee, and would look forward to having that discussion with the gentleman as well.
I thank the gentleman. The current CR, as the gentleman knows, expires March 18th, that we passed earlier this week. Senate passed, the President's now signed. Can I ask the gentleman his thoughts on going forward, what we might be expecting with respect to funding government from March 19th through September 30th for the balance of the fiscal year? And I yield to my friend.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and as the gentleman has already pointed out, the House, Mr. Speaker, has produced its position in H.R. 1. The difficulty is the Senate has failed to produce a Senate position, and so there really is very little foundation upon which to engage in any discussion as to how we're going to get through the remainder of the fiscal year. And I know that the minority leader was recently today out saying that the position on the part, I guess, of the Senate and perhaps your caucus is that there is a desire to bring about $41 billion of cuts. I would say to the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, $40 billion is not a cut. That's the status quo. And that's been our position all along, is we want to make sure we change the status quo, that we actually do what most Americans are having to do, which is tighten the belt and to cut spending in order to get this economy going. So I'd say to the gentleman, we would encourage the Senate and Leader Reid to act so that we can move forward. And until then, Mr. Speaker, I would say to my friend from Maryland that I would expect the House to continue its process of cutting $2 billion per week until we can see where the gentleman's caucus and then the Democrat leader in the Senate is. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his response. I might want to pursue that response just a little bit, however. The Pledge to America, as I understand it, said that you were going to cut $100 billion. Is that accurate?
I'd say, the gentleman, that the Pledge to America said that we were desirous of reducing discretionary spending, non-security spending, to 2008 levels. I yield back.
And this H.R. 1, as I understand it, is scored at $102 billion or thereabouts. Is that accurate?
I would say back to the gentleman, as he knows, the figure of $100 billion was taken from the difference between the President's FY011 request and the 2008 levels, which is how that figure has become. So I'd say to the gentleman, if he's trying to make the point about 100 versus 61, the gentleman is accurate when he says that the $100 billion of cuts off of 2011 request by the President is the same as $61 billion of cuts against the current level of spending at FY010 levels. So if I can make the gentleman's point for him, which is exactly why I say that insistence upon $41 billion or $40 billion in cuts is nothing but defense of the status quo. And that's what I say to the gentleman. That's unacceptable to our side. It's unacceptable to the American people.
I thank the gentleman for explaining my proposition, but if I might clarify a little more. What the gentleman has said, the way you get to $100 billion is counting that $41 billion that you say is the status quo and adding $60 billion or $61 billion to it to get to $102 billion or a little short of that. My point clearly is that the gentleman and his side of the aisle has clearly counted the $41 billion that he says is the status quo. The reason he has done so is because he said during the course of the campaign, and others said during the course of the campaign, they were going to cut $100 billion. And in fact, as I recall, the Speaker and yourself and other leaders made the point during the course of your initial consideration and the offer that was initially made to your conference that, in fact, the $41 billion was, in fact, a cut from the President's request of $41 billion. We agree with that, but we now believe that your side is saying, oh, no, that doesn't count. notwithstanding the fact it is $41 billion less than the President requested, and you counted that $41 billion less as part of the $100 billion you represented was part of the cuts that you had said you were going to make and that you, in fact, made. So my point is, as the gentleman has pointed out, that your $60 billion, by your side's argument of cutting $100 billion, it only gets to $100 billion because you're counting the $41 billion, which we have cut. Now, I say that for this reason. You made the $100 billion pledge prior to December. You made it prior to the election. Then we, in fact, cut from the figure you were using as the base, the 2011 base of the President's request. We cut $41 billion by freezing at 2010 levels. Now, very frankly, my point to you is, as I'm sure you know, that we have already come $41 billion, which means 41% of the way to where you wanted to get. We continue to want to discuss this matter. Hopefully we can move together and come to a compromise figure. I know the gentleman has not served on the Appropriations Committee. He serves on the Tax Writing Committee. But in the Appropriations Committee, we found an ability to come together and make agreement. I'm hopeful that we can do the same, but I think it unfair and incorrect, frankly, not to count $41 billion because we're now starting at 2010 levels as opposed to the level that you started at and we started at, which was the President's 2011 request, and that both of us have come that $41 billion, and the issue is how much further we're going to go. If the gentleman wants to make any further comment,
I would respond to the gentleman that we've already discussed the math here. The problem is the American people are waiting for us to act. And if the gentleman knows the position of Senator Reid and where he would like to go, other than maintain the status quo, then that's what we're looking for. The House has made its position known. Its position, again, is $100 billion off of the 2011 request or $61 billion off of the 2010 levels of current spending. And we have maintained the position all along, Mr. Speaker, that freezing spending at today's level is unacceptable. It will bankrupt us if we continue to spend at these levels. We have got to begin to show some fiscal restraint so we can get people back to work in this country. So I'm delighted to hear the gentleman say we need to cut more, and I'm hopeful that we can continue to see progress on that front. But thus far, the gentleman's colleague and all of our colleagues on the other side of the Capitol, Senator Reid, has not indicated where his position is, and that's what we need to move forward.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. I asked the gentleman, might I advise the leader on the other side of the Capitol that there is, in fact, a willingness on your side to compromise between 0 and 100? I yield to the gentleman.
I would ask the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, does the gentleman know of any position having been taken, any vote that has been taken in the Senate to indicate where they are and whether they have come off their position of defending the status quo? Again, I would say the gentleman, his leader, the minority leader, earlier today was in the press indicating that that is her position. She wants to defend the status quo. $41 billion in cuts. There is not a cut from the current level of spending. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. If that's the status quo, then I suggest to him he is not going to get to $100 billion, which he represented and his side represents they want to get to. We'll see whether or not they're prepared to do that. But I will tell my friend, if that's the position, then I think we will not be able to reach agreement because there appears to be no ability to compromise in that context. The gentleman counted the $41 billion during the course of the campaign. The gentleman counted that $41 billion when he made a representation to his caucus as to why you were offering a $32 billion cut, because together, given the fact that it was halfway through the year, that would, in fact, be tantamount to. But again, in each one of those instances, the gentleman counted the $41 billion. He is now saying, oh, no, that is the status quo. Does the gentleman know of any budget that President Bush signed in 01, 02, 03, 04, 05, and 06 that maintained either the status quo or cut below the so-called status quo?
Gentlemen,
when your side was in charge of both the House and the Senate and the Presidency.
Listen, Mr. Speaker, gentlemen and I have had similar conversations over the last couple of years. I really think it is best for all of us to see how we're going forward, not looking back. I know the gentleman would make the suggestion we could learn from past history. I'm all about that. But what I could say, Mr. Speaker, is we need a position by the other side in order to go forward so we can actually do what the American people want, which is to cut spending from current levels. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would simply suggest to the gentleman, hope that we can work together, as the gentleman suggests, come to resolution for the balance of the fiscal year. The gentleman has made a number of comments in the past with which I agree, that uncertainty undermines the economy. A quote that the gentleman said on the floor last year, working families and businesses remain gripped by economic uncertainty, and to this day, Washington has only made the problem worse. If we want to cut into the 9.8% unemployment, Mr. Chairman, we have to instill confidence in the economy and begin to foster an environment for job creation. I suggest to the gentleman we will not do that until we come to an agreement. Both sides need to work towards that end. I agree with the gentleman on that. I'm hopeful that the Senate will, in fact, make a suggestion in the near term, and I mean hopefully hours and a few days rather than weeks. The 18th will be on us, as you know, very soon. If we don't reach an agreement by next Thursday, in my opinion, we will not be able to get the paperwork done to get a bill ready to pass by Friday the 18th of a week from this coming Friday, 2 weeks from this Friday. I think that will be unfortunate and will lead to uncertainty and disruption both in the public sector and in the private sector. Let me ask you one more question on the issue of compromises. Will, assuming the Senate makes an offer and assuming it passes an offer or reaches an agreement, when it comes back, will there be any hearings on the proposed cuts and the ramifications of those cuts? I yield to the gentleman.
I would say to the gentleman, first of all, as to his suggestion about our adding to uncertainty and perhaps facilitating a government shutdown, we have said all along, we do not want to shut down the government, we want to cut spending. And as I said before to the gentleman, it is our intention to continue to go forward, reducing spending at the rate of $2 billion a week until we can see some signal from the Senate that they're serious about wanting to cut spending. As for the gentleman's inquiry about hearings on specific cuts as to a potential bill that will govern the route forward for the rest of the fiscal year, I would bring the gentleman's attention to ongoing hearings now as we proceed throughout this fiscal year about the 012 budget and spending that we should be about anyway. And let us not forget the reason why we find ourselves where we are is because the majority from the 111th Congress did not finish the business of this fiscal year, which again is why we find ourselves in the position of these expiring short-term CRs. We are dedicated to the notion of open process, as the gentleman knows, and I know he shares that goal as well, and we will continue to operate in that manner. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for that answer. The reason I asked that question, however, I don't know whether the gentleman had an opportunity to read a column in the New York Times by David Brooks, a relatively conservative columnist in the New York Times, as the gentleman knows, in which he wrote a column called The New Normal, and in paragraph 4 of which he started, in Washington, the Republicans who designed the cuts which are included in H.R. 1 for this fiscal year, seem to have done no serious policy evaluation. He goes on the next, or about 4 paragraphs later, to say, referring to his austerity principles. There are 3 austerity principles that he propounds. He said, never cut without an evaluation process. I think that we need cuts. I've said that. The gentleman said that. We are proceeding. In fact, we have done some of those, and we have agreement on some of those, as the gentleman knows. But there were no hearings, and that's why Mr. Brooks says that they seem to have done no serious policy evaluation of those cuts. That's why I asked that question, but I understand the gentleman's answer. Is the gentleman, and we'll bring this to a close, we have some concerns by the fact that a number of economists, a large number of economists, have expressed concern about the economic ramifications of some of the cuts and the magnitude of the cuts that are included. As you know, Ben Bernanke indicated that the spending plan could cost a couple of 100,000 jobs, a number he called not trivial. And according to Goldman Sachs, we might adversely affect GDP by 1.5 to 2% percentage points in the second and third quarters compared with current law, or as the gentleman refers to, the status quo. I ask the gentleman, is that of concern to you, and or do you believe that those evaluations are incorrect?
Mr. Speaker, thank the gentleman, and I would say always mindful of opinion makers, commentators, economists, and their view as to what's going on here in Washington. But I would say the gentleman, I think we've been down the road that the gentleman suggests is preferable before. We on this floor passed a nearly $800 billion stimulus bill, at least the gentleman's side passed it, and we saw the effects of spending that kind of money did not produce the kind of job creation that was desired or was promised. And if I recall, some of the economists that the gentleman refers to probably were ones that supported the notion that the stimulus bill would make sure that unemployment didn't exceed 8% if we went ahead and spent that money. I think we tried that before. And the gentleman also knows that we are borrowing nearly 40 cents out of every dollar we are spending. That is unsustainable. And so if the gentleman's focus is spend more money from Washington to create jobs, then essentially we are creating jobs, paying people we can't afford to pay. So what the position is from our side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker, is we want to be honest with the people. We want to look for long-term solutions that get this economy going again. We all know that most jobs are created in the private sector. We all know that most jobs come from the entrepreneurial aspirations of the people of this country. It is they who continue to point to Washington as the problem. It is they who say that government's explosive growth, government's continued increase in appetite for capital is making it so we can't see investment occur here in this country. And if you want to fix the economy, deal with the deficit. That's what we're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comment, and certainly I agree with him that we need to deal with the deficit. And as the gentleman knows, I've been pretty vocal about that and indicated that we need to look at the whole spectrum of spending. Focusing on 14% of the budget will not get us there. I think the gentleman probably agrees with that proposition. I know the chairman of the Budget Committee agrees with that proposition. I may not agree with the chairman of the Budget Committee on how he wants to get there, but I think we do agree that we have to look at all of the spending that we do, and that bringing down the deficit is of critical consequence. Let me say to the gentleman, however, when he speaks about jobs, as he knows, we lost 3.8 million jobs in 2008, the last year of the Bush administration. The last year of the Obama administration, the last 12 months, we've gained 1.1 million private sector jobs. So when the gentleman says that the Recovery Act did not have the effect that the administration hoped for. He is correct. We went up above the 8% unemployment. But the gentleman, I'm sure, knows that during the last 12 months we have gained jobs on an average of $569,000 over the last 5 months, so 500,000 jobs. Is that enough? It's not. Frankly, we're going to have to be at 300 or 400,000 per month to overcome the number of jobs that were lost prior to or during the recession, which started, of course, in '07. I want to agree with the gentleman and hope that we can work together on looking at the entire challenge that confronts us in bringing this deficit down. But I tell my friend to continually focus, as the gentleman has been doing in this colloquy and in other colloquies, on simply the discretionary spending, non-defense, non-security spending, while we certainly need to cut fraud, waste, and abuse and cut duplication and make government simpler and more accessible and more cost-effective for the American people. We also need to be, as you said, honest with the American people that if you cut out every penny of the portion of the budget at which you are looking, we will not solve the deficit problem. So I say to my friend, I look forward to working with him. Our side looks forward to working with him and his side. I've had discussions. I see Mr. Dreyer on the floor. We need to work together on this issue because the gentleman's correct. It's a critical area. And unless the gentleman wants more time, I'll yield back.
I would just say to the gentleman, thank him for the courtesy of yielding. That is exactly why we're turning to mandatory spending next week. As the gentleman knows, we'll be fast on the discussion of the budget as well. As the gentleman knows and can expect that our budget will approach the issue of entitlements, and we feel it very necessary for us to begin that discussion. And frankly, we're dismayed by the fact that the White House did not include any mention or discussion or did not deal with entitlements in its budget proposal. So we hope, and I know the gentleman is earnest in his desire to want to try and deal with the deficit both on the discretionary and the mandatory side. Look forward to working with him towards that end. Now,
I thank the gentleman, and just in concluding on that, the administration did, of course, appoint a commission, Mr. Bowles and Senator Simpson, which did, in fact, look at the spectrum of spending, have made some very substantive recommendations. The administration has commended those recommendations to us for consideration. But the administration also said that we need to make sure that we invest in growing our economy if we expect to bring the deficit down, investing in the education of our children, investing in our infrastructure, investing in innovation and invention. And I agree with the administration on that, and I think we need to be very careful that we pay attention to both the investments and the reduction of the deficit. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 2 p.m. tomorrow. When the House adjourns on that day, it adjourn to meet on Tuesday, March 8, 2011, when it shall convene at 2 p.m. for morning hour debate and 4 p.m. for legislative business. And when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourned to meet at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, March 9th.
Without objection, so ordered. The Chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is
Speaker,
recognized.
I didn't want to prolong the colloquy, but I have to say that both my friends, Mr. Hoyer and Mr. Cantor, were talking about the imperative for job creation and economic growth. And there is a bipartisan consensus in this institution. We all want to see private sector jobs created. We have an opportunity to work together in a bipartisan way to do something that President Obama addressed in his State of the Union message here in this chamber. He talked about the need for us to pass first the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and he also included, I'm happy to say, the Colombia and Panama agreements. All of those agreements have been pending. The Colombia and Panama agreements actually preceded the Korea agreement, and we know, Mr. Speaker, that if we were to pass all three of these pending trade agreements, we could create good union and non-union jobs here in this country in the manufacturing sectors of our economy. If you look at companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, Whirlpool, other manufacturing companies right here in the United States, creating an opportunity for those union and non-working union members to sell their products into Latin America is very important. Let's create jobs. Let's pass all three of these agreements. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico rise? Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to Marine Corporal Joe Silversmith, who passed away earlier this week at the age of 86. As a Navajo code talker, Corporal Silversmith earned the Silver Congressional Medal of Honor for his service during World War II when he answered the call of duty and served his country in the South Pacific from 1943 to 1946. Corporal Silversmith was part of an invaluable group of Navajo men who transmitted secret communications during the war that contributed to victory for the Allied forces. As we take this moment to remember the contributions of Corporal Silversmith, we are reminded of the brave service of all Navajo code talkers. Corporal Silversmith and his brothers-in-arms were nothing short of heroes for their efforts during the war. Joe Silversmith went on to become a minister after returning home from the war and a well-respected member of the community, always supporting those he ministered to. He will be missed. As we mourn the passing of Joe Silversmith and celebrate his life, my thoughts and prayers are with his wife, Ramona, and their 2 daughters during this sad time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida rise? The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Monday, I met with parents of young children in Davie, Florida, in my district, who attend early childhood education classes at Crayons Child Care. We spoke about how vital early education is in the development of young children, how early education increases high school graduation rates, how 50 years of solid research has shown that early childhood education reduces crime and delinquency and yields up to a $7 return on every dollar invested. Unfortunately, though, with the passage of H.R. 1 just over a week ago, this body made the largest cut to education in our nation's history. Now, we all understand that our nation needs to cut spending, but the society that balances its budget on the backs of its children should not be surprised when the spine of its future is broken. These children are 2, 3, and 4 years old. They didn't run up the debt and the deficit of our country, but the response from Republicans in the House of Representatives is that they would pay for it. That just doesn't make sense. It is morally wrong. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
That's 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Today, President Obama and the Mexican president announced that in a short order, Mexico will begin to reduce its extortionate tariffs on U.S. goods, many from my district and my state. That's good news. But we shouldn't accept a bad deal with Mexico that jeopardizes the safety of the traveling public on our highways, that further jeopardizes our security on the border with Mexico, and finally puts at risk hundreds of thousands of American jobs. Just think about it. What American trucking company is going to send their trucks south of the border into the lawless zones with the extortion and the kidnapping and everything else going on down there? No. If we give Mexico free license to drive north into the upper 48 states of the United States, we will lose hundreds of thousands of jobs. So it's good news they're addressing the tariffs, but we're going to be scrutinizing the details of any deal that this president reaches with the president of Mexico to protect our safety of our traveling public, the security of our borders, and American jobs.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there further 1-minute speeches? Hearing nothing, without objection, the earlier request of the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Jackson, to insert extraneous materials in the record is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are serious times in which we're living. Supposedly there's a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. We certainly do. And I've really been shocked that the mainstream media has not done more in the way of stories on the Americans, the 4 Americans, on a boat that were hijacked and then killed. And of course, it made some news on February 22nd when it happened, but it appears it didn't survive much of a 24-hour cycle. This is an act of war against America. This was an act of war against 4 peace-loving people who apparently had the gall to travel around and offer Bibles to different places, and apparently were spending American blood and treasure in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, only to find out that they are persecuting Christians in a manner that is reminiscent of why people came to Europe and tried to create a country in which Christians could worship freely without being persecuted, tortured, imprisoned, or killed simply for their religious beliefs. In this case, though, it was a matter of Barbary pirates. And I know that most people apparently in Washington have not learned enough from history, but there are so many history lessons that make very clear what Ronald Reagan used to say when he said, no country ends up being attacked because they're too strong. What Barbary pirates have seen, what people around the world have seen, including Libya, Turkey, Lebanon, Iran, they see that we have been promoting weakness in the United States and promoting a very weak vision of ourselves around the world. This story from February 22nd indicates that the pirates fired a rocket-propelled grenade at a U.S. Navy destroyer that was following the hijacked yacht with 4 Americans on board. Then gunfire erupted, and 4 Americans that had been taken hostage were fatally wounded. They were killed. I don't know what this administration needs to see in the way of current events, or why this administration will not take anyone from the myriad of lessons from history that when you're dealing with pirates, when you're dealing with religious fanatics, people who want to destroy you, could care nothing about your life, your pursuit of happiness, you don't placate them. You don't try to negotiate with them. You don't show that, gee, we don't know what to do, because what you get is more piracy, more terrorism. There's only one way to respond, and that's the way that the United States did in its early days, in the early 1800s, with Thomas Jefferson as president. Some don't go back that far and learn history. All they want to do is look at a fictional approach to U.S. history that says, in essence, gee, we're mean, we're colonialists, we have subjugated people all around the world to our imperialist whims. But unfortunately, despite all the hyperbole and the rhetoric, what we have done is expend American blood and American treasure in the name of freedom, not just American freedom, freedom of Iraqis, freedom of Muslims in Eastern Europe, freedom of people all across Europe, France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Poland, all across. Americans have given their lives in the name of freedom. All across the Pacific, given their lives, their last full measure of devotion for freedom. No racist view, but absolutely, as Jesus said, greater love had no one than this, that they're willing to lay down their life for friends. In the case of Americans, we've laid down lives for people we didn't even know because the concept of freedom was so important. And in our earliest days, Washington, of course, was quite concerned that having won the revolution, we were still not strong enough to survive. And so often you'll see a new government trying to arise in a country. It overcommits to other obligations with regard to military, and they lose their young nation. Washington was afraid of that. And through the 1790s, we had Barbary pirates. We had pirates off the coast of North Africa taking Americans hostage, capturing American ships, taking American sailors hostage, and they would either kill them or they would torture them, but they would ransom them if they had not killed them. And at one point, I had read that as much as 18% of the American budget was being spent to pay ransom to get American sailors back. And at one point, Thomas Jefferson was one who was sent over on behalf of the United States to negotiate with these Muslims about why they were attacking American ships, and the discussion apparently included questions as to why would you attack American ships? We've not harmed you in any way. We're no threat to you. We're not threatening you. And one history lesson indicates that Jefferson was told, well, under our religion, if we are killed while we are taking action against an infidel like Americans, then we go straight to paradise and we're rewarded. Jefferson was shocked because as a man who was so well-read, he couldn't believe that any world religion would encourage the killing of innocent people and that killing of innocent people would gain you a trip to paradise. So he got his own English copy of the Quran that is still over in the Library of Congress. He couldn't believe it. He wanted to find for himself. American history students will know that we finally created the United States Marines. And those that are not familiar with the history may still be familiar with the Marine Corps hymn that says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." Well, it was the shores of Tripoli to which the Marines were sent with the message, we can't continue to pay ransom to bloodthirsty religious zealots, and so we're at war with you until you stop. And it was only when the Americans showed strength that they could not be pushed around, they would not be taken hostage without a response, and that there would be American blood and treasure spent in the name of freedom to anyone who tries to threaten the freedom of Americans on the high seas or on American soil. And because the Marines fought so valiantly and fiercely and fearlessly, those pirates, the Muslim pirates, learned a valuable lesson that, gee, maybe we ought to leave these people alone for a while, and they did for a long time. But in 1979, after the Carter administration had welcomed back the Ayatollah Khomeini as a man of peace who would bring great peace to the region, And the Carter administration had snubbed its nose and abandoned a man who didn't seem to be a very nice man, but the Shah of Iran, and put all their eggs in the basket with this wonderful man of peace, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who it turns out would also like to see the United States destroyed and viewed Americans as infidels as well, like the original Barbary pirates. I was in the Army at Fort Benning when the hostages were taken. No one at Fort Benning that I knew of was dying to go to Iran, but most everybody I knew at Fort Benning was willing to go and thought we should go because an act of war had been committed against the United States. And under everyone's interpretation of international law, when a United States embassy or United States compound is attacked in any nation, it is an attack on that nation's own soil. It is an act of war under everyone's interpretation of international law. And if you go back and you review the television footage of the day, and I'm relying on my memory of those days because we were certainly paying attention. We didn't know who might be sent. Turns out none of us were sent from Fort Benning because the Carter administration, as eloquent as President Carter was and as peace-loving and as well-meaning as he was, he felt surely these people in Iran will see how much I care. They'll see how much I really love them and will negotiate, and they'll be impressed by our words, they'll be impressed by our negotiations, and they'll let our people go. But that's not the way those folks who view us as infidels who need to be killed work. And in fact, if you go to your own experience back to a schoolyard, if a bully is picking on you, or especially a smaller person is picking on a bigger person, and you don't defend yourself, but instead say, let me pay you money if you'll leave me alone, not only respect for the bigger person, they have nothing but hatred, and now you've added contempt, because they can't believe somebody is such a coward and so weak when they appear to be so big and strong that they would pay someone who hates them to leave them alone. So you get hatred, you get contempt, and you get more violence. And that's what we've seen. We have continued to this day to pay the price for the message that was sent in 1979 and 1980 for appearing to be so weak and helpless in the face of Iranians, we're told initially students, who committed an act of war and then gave our hostages to the Iranian government. Now, as I watched all this unfold, it appears to me as a young man in the Army that the Ayatollah's spokesman kept coming out and talking about the students. The students attack. The students have the hostages. And that seemed to me, as an inexperienced person in the way of foreign policy, but someone who had studied a great deal of world history, that was their back door for Iran. That was their way of saying, look, we don't know if the United States is going to be the powerful country we're afraid they might be, or if they're really the paperless, the toothless tiger that we saw tuck their tail between their legs and run out of Vietnam. So let's just test. Let's talk about the students taking the hostages. Let's talk about the students committing the atrocity on invading the embassy. And if America steps up and says, you either get our hostages back from the students within 48 or 72 hours, or we're coming in and we're addressing this act of war against the United States of America, and we're getting our hostages back, and if you kill them, we will be at war with anybody who condoned that action, and that would include the Iranian government that allowed this to happen and did not intercede when they could have. That's what you have to do, and that's what we didn't do. So it appeared as it all unfolded that after 2 or 3 days, the Ayatollah realized America is as weak as we hoped they were. This President Carter, he thinks he's a man of peace. We see him as a man of nothing but weakness, as the poorest leader the Americans could offer. So they quit talking about the students have the hostages, the students attacked the embassy, and they started talking about we have the hostages, because they gave us time to show whether or not we react with strength. They saw we reacted with weakness. You can't negotiate with people like that. You instill more contempt on top of the hatred. And, of course, I've filed in all 3 Congresses I've been a part of, and this Congress will be no different. My UN voting accountability bill that basically says if you vote against the United States more than half the time in the UN in any year, you will receive not 1 dime of financial assistance from the U.S. in the subsequent year. Now, some say, gee, that seems so heartless. Well, the fact is, we have been paying money to prop up regimes like Mubarak's. Is it any wonder that the report is he has billions of dollars in the bank when we've been paying Egypt billions of dollars that doesn't appear to have really gotten to the people and helped them? We're doing it all over the world. We're paying tyrants who hate us and would like to see our way of life destroyed with American treasure. It doesn't buy love. It doesn't buy happiness. It buys contempt. And as I've said repeatedly, you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free. And at a time when the United States is struggling so with economic issues of just staying afloat, why should we be paying tyrants that hate us and paying people who have not helped their people? I mean, you look at the money that we poured into the Palestinian group and see how much of the money we paid in to help the homeless Palestinians has been paid toward building homes. It should be a no-brainer. Palestinians, so many of them hate the Israelis because they have no home. So they're told, well, blame the Israelis. So they do, and they grow up hating them. Well, why not, with the billions and billions of dollars we've paid out of this country to the Palestinians, why have they not used it to build homes so those people won't continue to hate Israelis and to hate Americans? It's no secret we're not buying affection with the billions of dollars we're spending overseas. It makes no sense to these countries who hate us that we keep giving them money, but they figure if we're that stupid, sure, they'll take our money. And all the while, the dollar gets weaker and weaker, and you have more and more claims from people we're giving money to get rid of the dollar as a reserve currency. And when that happens, if it ever happens, then our economy is in for just the fastest spiral down anyone could possibly imagine. Dollars are required to buy much of the oil in the world. We keep showing this kind of stupidity in our foreign policies, and there will be consequences. There are consequences for 4 Americans who were hijacked and then killed. You know, as a former judge and state Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals, when I hear stories, I'm constantly looking for evidence so that I can find out, is there any substance to the story that's been heard. Now we see that there was a naval destroyer shadowing the hijacked boat of these Americans who were simply going out trying to help people in the world. They were not a threat to anyone. They were providing Bibles and hope from what we can find out. Well, how does that compare to the incident of the captain of the Bainbridge being taken hostage by 3 pirates and how it concluded? There were conservative talk show hosts that said, hey, we disagree with so much that President Obama has been doing to this country and in our name, but looks like he got this one right. Well, a story was circulating, and I was curious whether it had truth to it, that when the SEAL team was deployed, the order was a little different than normal, where instead of the order saying, go rescue these hostages, and they put together their own game plan for how you go about achieving the goal that's ordered, that this order was a little different. It just said, you know, go to the ship and receive further orders there. A little different for a SEAL team. That's what we were hearing. And that they did the drop at night, and they had the SEAL team there, and for basically 3 days they had a bead on all 3 of the pirates in the boat with the captain they had taken hostage, and that at any moment they could have taken out all 3 pirates for those 3-day period. But the story went, what was circulating was that the President's order said, do not use deadly force under any circumstances unless the life of the captain is in imminent danger of immediately being taken. Only under those circumstances are you to use deadly force. Well, when a pirate group attacks a ship, it is an act of war by those pirates. And this administration's response here is just to have a Navy destroyer tag along and try to negotiate. And they were in the process of trying to negotiate, apparently, when the rocket-propelled grenade was fired at the Navy destroyer, and then the 4 hostages were killed. Well, the story was the administration didn't want to take any action against the pirates. We'll just negotiate our way through this. And it's one of the problems with being one of the most gifted orators in American history. If you're that gifted of an orator, the temptation arises for you to think you can talk people into anything. That people that hate your country, when they see that you really sympathize with them and not your own hostages as much, certainly there's sympathy for the hostages, but if they perceive that there is sympathy for the pirates or for those attacking Americans, then, you know, they're willing to negotiate, but it appears to be weakness. And obviously, these pirates in February were not impressed with America when they took the Americans hostage, committed an act of war, and even had a naval destroyer behind because they perceived we were weak. Well, the story about the captain of the Bainbridge that was going around was that for basically 3 days, the SEALs were not allowed to take out the pirates, that they could have at any time. And then we heard on the news during that the captain, while the pirates may have been falling asleep, was able to get out of the boat, get into the water. As soon as I heard that, I thought, wow, he was trying to give the SEALs clear shots at the pirates. He must have figured, as I did, that they surely would have taken an open shot if they knew they wouldn't jeopardize the captain, the American captain. And so by his jumping out of the boat, it gave them a clear shot to take the pirates out without jeopardizing the captain, but no shots were fired. That surely had to perplex him. It sure did me and many others. Why didn't they just take out the pirates before they drug him back in the boat? But our American SEALs did nothing, not because they couldn't or wouldn't, but the story was they were doing that because the president had issued an order that they were not to use deadly force. And the story was going that the captain, when he went out of the boat and these guys came to their senses, that they put their guns down to grab him and put him back into the boat, and therefore he was not under immediate threat of death, so the SEALs were not allowed to kill him. It must have perplexed the captain that nothing was done when he got out, but nothing was done. The story went that these SEALs were following orders. And then came an occasion when one of the pirates that had a gun on his arm or over his shoulder waved his weapon in the direction of the captain, and that's when the SEAL team commander realized he's waving his weapon at the captain. We cannot take a chance. The order to shoot was given that could have been given any time for 3 days and ended that terrible ordeal, was given not by the president but by the commander on the scene. And our well-trained SEALs did a remarkable job in taking out 2 of the pirates and rescuing the captain. The story went, could have happened any time, but the order of the president restrained them from doing that because he was convinced they could just surely know how good and loving and peaceful we were, and they would eventually let these folks go. Because this administration apparently had not learned the lesson that Thomas Jefferson had to learn. You can't deal with peaceful negotiating efforts or even paying people money or snubbing your allies and friends to try to convince them that you're really a great person they ought to love. Those things don't work. You have to go to war against them and let them know when they attack Americans, when they attack America, that we are coming after them. We don't have to be at war with a country. We don't have to be at war with an entire race or group of people. There's no need in that. But you go to war with the people that are at war with you. And this administration has not done that. We have 4 Americans who are dead. Obviously, this administration didn't want Americans to die. Of course they didn't. That's a terrible thing. And they didn't want it, would love to have avoided it, certainly. But it's not enough to intend good consequences. You have to study your history lessons and do so objectively, learn from history so you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And that's what we've been doing. And as much as I respected and think Ronald Reagan was one of our greatest presidents, in 1983, when our Marine barracks was blown up and we withdrew from Beirut, it appeared to be further evidence of weakness. And I can't help but believe from people I've talked to that were part of the administration that if he had to do it all over, he would do it in a different manner. But he had advisors telling him accurately, we're in Lebanon on a peacekeeping mission. We have finished the mission. There is no need to keep staying there. Let's go ahead and get out. There's no reason. We've finished our job. Let's get out before any other Americans get killed. The problem was when we did, it appeared to be follow-up weakness added to what President Carter had shown on behalf of this country. And now we see it on the high seas. We have a naval destroyer. We have SEAL teams. We have Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard. We have Air Force that can achieve things nobody in any prior service could have ever dreamed could be accomplished. We have a better military than I ever dreamed we could have had back when we had just gone to an all-volunteer Army and I was concerned about our national safety. Amazing military, smart, motivated, and yet, despite that, we're showing weakness. Now, the story that was going around was that the captain that ordered the fire got a hot call from the White House saying, you know, really chewing him out, that the SEAL team around didn't know what was being said, but they knew that their commander was getting chewed out royally. And supposedly the story that was circulating was that he eventually said, "That's fine, sir." And that apparently wasn't the president. It said, but you can tell the president that if he wants to continue this rear chewing of me and my team, we're going to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base, wherever they came in, at a certain time, and the media knows, and you can dress them down there, or you might want a good photo op, and you could be there, tell the president he could be there to congratulate him. And of course, there was a wonderful photo op, and these great heroes were welcomed by our president as he should have. That was the story going around back after the attack on the Bainbridge. And so ever since then, I've been looking. I'd heard the story, and I was wondering, is there any evidence of similar activity that might give substance to that story? And how we handled these 4 Americans, these loving, caring Americans being killed on the high seas, seems to be that kind of evidence that this is our mode of operation. You commit an act of war against Americans, you commit an act of war against our ships, and we're going to send a Navy ship to follow you and try to offer you bribes to leave us alone and leave the people alone. But you don't have to worry much. But after the rocket-propelled grenade was fired, it all went bad, and 4 Americans are dead. It's shocking. We need to show strength. And I was a year ago in April in West Africa with a group called Mercy Ships that brings healing. The lame walk, the blind see. They bring in a ship into a port of a country that needs health care, and they provide treatment to thousands of people. And I'd gone to see this for myself, and before I left the ship, after the days there, over the Easter break, some of the West Africans wanted to visit with me, and the oldest, a wonderful, wonderful man, I don't know how much education, but a smart man, great wisdom, he said, in essence, we wanted to make sure you understood. As Africans, we were excited when you elected a black president. We were excited. We thought it was wonderful. But since he has been president, we've become very concerned and a bit afraid because we see him showing weakness for America. And we need you to please convey in Washington that America is the hope for people, Christians like them, people who want peace around the world. We're their hope. And if you show weakness, and if you weaken America, we don't have hope in this world. As Christians, they knew where they would go in the next life, but they also knew that America stood for hope in this world. And when we show weakness, as we have been doing, then it signals the tyrants to have their way, and we've got to stop that. Now, I want to, may I inquire how much time is remaining?